the country which is oftenly in the news for one thing or another. Yet in the recent times, the country has been a topic of discussion because of its rising debt and declining economic growth. Now the question is, how Pakistan ended up here? And is it a debt-trapped economy? Well, let's find that out in this video. To get an accurate answer to our questions, we need to start with the economic history of Pakistan. At the time of its independence in 1947, Pakistan was a very poor and predominantly agricultural country. After independence, the country took a number of steps to restructure its agricultural industry, which was to boost the output and exports. Then in the 1950s, the government started to focus on industrialization. For that they adopted the Soviet-era 5-year planning model. In the 60s, Pakistan's average annual GDP growth rate was 6.8%, which was good considering for that time. But this growth didn't last for a long period. Political disturbance which had started in late 1960s, ended with the crisis of 1971. And the consequent separation of the former East Pakistan shook the country. The new government took over during deteriorating economic growth, and the country was faced with post-war rehabilitation challenges. Pakistan suffered from a devastated economy, high rate of inflation, and stagnant agriculture and industrial sector. In addition, they shifted the economic strategy toward nationalization, which again impacted private investment in the economy. Yet in the 80s, due to slower economic growth, nationalization policy was reversed, and the country saw a slight economic growth. In the same time period, the country's remittance income increased drastically. However, this growth also didn't last, as remittance declined in 1990, the government deficit increased, and GDP growth declined. Simultaneously, debt to GDP ratio was increasing, and the country started to feel the heat of the rising debt. So the answer to the question, is Pakistan in a debt trap? Is yes. The fact is that Pakistan's external debt continues to accumulate, and they have to borrow more dollars to repay old loans. Which, you may call it as debt trap. In this graph, you can see how Pakistan's external debt has risen over the years, and it has shot up from 2015 to nearly double. If you look at the last 2 years of financial data, then Pakistan's public debt went past 87% of GDP at the end of 2019 and 20, up from about 72% of GDP at the end of 2017 and 18. Also, the country's total external debt and liabilities rose to $113.8 billion in fiscal year 2020, from $106.3 billion in 2019. This problem has worsened due to the pandemic and low tax collection. Data released by the State Bank of Pakistan reveals that the current government paid $11.9 billion in external public debt servicing during 2019 and 2020. This is a huge amount of money that could have been used for other activities such as education, health services, and for other things. Pakistan is also unable to increase its exports, which remain stuck at $23 to $24 billion a year. This reduces the foreign reserves of the country, as they import more than they export. Also, it increases the reliance on remittance money for its foreign reserves. Over the years, Pakistan has obtained loans from international institutions such as IMF, Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and from countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and China. Perhaps the most worrying thing for Pakistan is their increasing dependence on Chinese loans, through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or the CPEC project in the country. The CPEC is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is aiming to connect Europe and Africa to the Chinese mainland. And CPEC is considered an important part of this project, as it reduces China's dependency from traveling through Strait of Malacca. Coming back to CPEC, as I have said before, it's a multi-billion-dollar project, aiming to develop Pakistan's infrastructure like ports, roads, railway, and power generation projects. In 2020, these projects were worth more than $62 billion. Even with this massive investment, adequate jobs were not created. And major work is done by Chinese workers, and not Pakistanis. In recent years, many countries including the US, and many other think tanks have worried about China's BRI projects. Because it has been observed that, many countries who accepted these projects are being pushed in debt trap. Like Sri Lanka, Tajikistan, and countries in Africa. And Pakistan is not exceptional. Pakistan has already given China exclusive rights, coupled with a tax holiday to run their Gwadar port for the next 40 years. So what can Pakistan do to improve its economic situation, and avoid bankruptcy? Well, first and the most important thing is that Pakistan needs is a more aggressive debt restructuring program. Currently, the country spends 1/3 of its federal budget on interest of debts. And this is not a good sign for a developing country. Also, the country needs to cut down their military spending, because a large chunk of their budget goes to the defense, which does not generate good returns. And speaking of military spending, Pakistan is often criticized for its terror financing and money laundering issues. Because of this, they are in the gray list of Financial Action Task Force. It is estimated that, from 2008 the country could have lost more than $35 billion in lost opportunities. Also, the investors are not confident due to country's gray listing in FATF. So the country really needs to focus on unlisting itself from the gray list by taking appropriate action. Now if we look at the bright side, Pakistan still has opportunities to grow. You see, Pakistan has a massive population, with the average age of their citizens being just 22 years. This gives them an advantage in demographic dividend. To know what is demographic dividend, please watch our video linked above. Now this growing population could help the country to improve their productivity and consumer sector. Already Pakistan has a growing middle class which could grow beyond 100 million in 2025. So it is easy for a country to capitalize itself from the growing middle class. This country also has another advantage, which is rising cash flow from remittance. Even though it acts like a brain drain for the country in the long term, it is beneficial in the short term. In the end, we can say that Pakistan still has a chance to catch the train of opportunities. With deep structural reforms, Pakistan could come out of this debt trap and move forward towards economic prosperity. So, what are your views about this country? Let us know in the comments below. Also, if you are new to this channel, please consider subscribing. Thank you.